Theranos raised over $700 million on a machine, promising many blood tests from one finger prick. One drop in, a wall of results out, a whole laboratory in a box. But the SEC later said its analyzer completed only a small number of tests. Most samples ran on other companies' machines. A jury convicted Holmes on 4 investor fraud counts. Sentence 135 months. Rewind. In 2003, 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes left Stanford and started Theranos. The idea was not small. Make blood testing faster, cheaper, and far less intimidating. The promise was a small fingerstick sample instead of a traditional draw, then rapid results from a compact machine. A frighteningly ordinary medical chore made cinematic. That message had emotional power before it had technical proof. Nobody needs a PowerPoint to understand why fewer needles and faster answers sound wonderful. The company was selling a future tense. Testing would be simpler, smaller, and everywhere. In Silicon Valley, future tense can sometimes arrive wearing a valuation. The story attracted powerful names, a prestigious board, and an aura of certainty. But an aura is not a validation study. It is closer to stage lighting. The company had a simple visual language: one red drop, one black box, endless results. Next came the part that is harder to illustrate: what the box could actually do. Theranos called one of its proprietary devices the Edison. In the public story, it was a tiny laboratory. In the real story, its limits became the whole plot. An FDA decision in 2015 covered a defined Theranos HSV1 assay and specified sample types. That is how medical regulation normally sounds: precise, narrow, and gloriously uncinematic. A broad menu of laboratory tests sounds like one machine doing everything, but laboratory work is a collection of different methods, thresholds, controls, and failure points. The SEC later said the proprietary analyzer could complete only a small number of tests. That phrase is deliberately modest. The visual consequence was not modest at all. A black box can create drama. It can also make independent checking awkward, especially when the claim is huge and the details remain stubbornly inside the box. The machine was only half the product. The other half was belief: investors, partners, retail counters, magazine covers, and a number that made the whole story feel inevitable. In 2014, private investments implied an estimated $9 billion valuation for Theranos. That is a valuation, not a bank balance, but it is still a very loud number. Forbes estimated Holmes' wealth at $4.5 billion, then later revised that estimate to zero. Private market paper can fold surprisingly fast when the paper is examined. The SEC said Theranos raised more than $700 million from investors. In a startup story, each new round can look like proof. It is not the same thing. The promise reached retail counters and public headlines. That made the machine feel less like a prototype and more like a familiar service waiting behind a pharmacy door. Prestige multiplied the message. Famous backers and polished presentations are useful for attention. They are not a laboratory result, a clinical control, or a replication. The louder the promise became, the more dangerous one question became: where were the results actually coming from? The answer was hiding in a different machine. According to the SEC, the proprietary analyzer handled only a small number of tests. The company performed the vast majority of patient tests on modified or standard commercial analyzers. That is the documentary's central relay race. A fingerstick sample entered the brand story, then the visible path and the actual processing path could diverge. A compact device doing a few things can be real. A compact device claimed to do almost everything carries a burden of proof that gets heavier with every extra result. The SEC said Theranos claimed its products were deployed by the Department of Defense on the battlefield. The SEC said the technology was never deployed by the Department of Defense. Then came the business math. The SEC said Theranos forecast more than $100 million of 2014 revenue. It said actual operating revenue was a little more than 100,000. This was not one bad demo. It was a widening gap between a product story and the evidence behind it. Eventually, people outside the company started pulling at that gap. In October 2015, Wall Street Journal reporting described former employees' concerns that Theranos used conventional analyzers for many tests despite its public claims. The sealed box met reporting. A company under pressure can answer with lawyers, statements, and more confidence. Confidence is fast. Independent documents, controls, and replication tend to be slower and much ruder. The story was no longer only about investors. Regulators began examining laboratory operations and claims. In health technology, the audience eventually includes people with clipboards and authority. CMS's 2017 CLIA registry listed Theranos' Newark laboratory among labs whose certificate had been suspended, limited, or revoked. The boldest promise now had an official paper trail. The old growth machine ran backward, headlines hardened, partners left, and the futuristic counter became a caution tape dispenser. Same story engine, suddenly traveling downhill. By then, the case had moved beyond skepticism. The question was no longer whether the pitch sounded futuristic. It was what the government could prove about the people who sold it. In 2018, federal prosecutors charged Holmes and Ramesh Balwani with wire fraud schemes. An indictment is an allegation, not a conviction, so the words matter here. The indictment alleged that doctors and patients were encouraged to use Theranos services even though certain tests could not consistently produce accurate and reliable results. That was the allegation. Separately, the SEC charged Theranos, Holmes, and Balwani in 2018. Theranos and Holmes settled the SEC case, while Holmes neither admitted nor denied the SEC allegations. The SEC settlement included a $500,000 penalty and a 10-year bar from serving as an officer or director of a public company. Civil consequences had arrived before trial. The company itself dissolved in 2018. A brand built around a tiny portable future ended as a stack of files, creditors, and a name nobody could use casually again. But a company can disappear faster than a court case. The final judgment would depend on a jury, evidence, legal definitions, and a distinction that the headlines often missed. On January 3, 2022, a federal jury convicted Holmes of 1 investor fraud conspiracy count and 3 investor wire fraud counts. 4 counts: investor fraud. The DOJ said the 3 wire fraud counts involved transfers totaling more than $140 million. That number belongs to the wires in those counts, not every dollar in the story. The same jury acquitted Holmes on the patient-related fraud counts. That is not a footnote. It changes the exact sentence a responsible documentary has to say. In November 2022, a federal judge sentenced Holmes to 135 months in prison, 11 years and 3 months. The black box had become a court number. There is no clever montage that turns fraud into a tidy moral. Investors lost money. Patients and doctors faced claims they could not evaluate from a glossy brochure. So what survives after the valuation, the lawsuit, and the sentence? Not a stock tip, not a medical rule, just a standard that should have arrived much earlier. The SEC's message was unusually plain. Innovators must tell investors what technology can do today, not what they hope it will do tomorrow. That is the central fracture line. Independent evidence is unglamorous by design. It is repeatable, inspectable, and often slower than a launch party, which is exactly why it matters when health claims get big. The Theranos visual vocabulary was unforgettable. Red drops, black turtlenecks, black machines, gold headlines. The missing visual was the one that mattered most, a clear proof trail. That is why this story still lands. It is not about whether ambition is bad. It is about what happens when ambition asks to be trusted before it can be checked. Theranos did not collapse because one red flag was missed. It collapsed because the distance between the promise and the proof became too large to keep hiding. The court case ended a company. It did not make the underlying question less relevant. When a claim is extraordinary, where is the ordinary inspectable proof? For this story, the proof trail had 3 missing links: a broad claim, independent confirmation, and a clear account of what machine was actually running the test. That is not cynicism. It is the opposite, a respect for good work, honest limits, and the people who have to live with the result when a promise leaves the pitch deck. That was Theranos, a tiny blood sample, a giant promise, and a very expensive lesson in the difference between a story and evidence. More money stories next.